Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Andrea Maticic-Kaley, and I am the Executive Director for the Center for Law and Global Affairs at Arizona State University's Law School. The center is the hub of all international activity, research, student projects at the College of Law. And we have with us in DC 3 students who represent the center. Hannah Knight, a Patent Boggs Fellow at Human Rights Watch, Ahmad Daboul, who worked with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Sam Pritchett, who worked with the ACLU. They're all symbolic of what we're trying to achieve with our students and our law school. I want to welcome you all here to this exciting event commemorating 80 years of the UN Charter and celebrating the publication of the UN Charter's 5 Pillars for Humankind, co-authored by ASU Ambassador David Sheffer and Dr. Mark Ellis. This is the first official collaboration between the Center for Law and Global Affairs and ASU's Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security Lab. I think it's a natural partnership since both groups are part of ASU's global impact that we're making across the world. Further, there's another reason that this collaboration is so natural. Ambassador Sheffer serves as a faculty member for both LDNS and the law school. Further, he's someone I've known for decades. I first met David, and I don't know if he still remembers, when I was a young prosecutor at the ICTY, and I was called with all other US citizens to an event at the US Embassy in The Hague to meet the first ever US Ambassador at Large for war crimes. Having just been appointed by Madeleine Albright, David participated not only as Ambassador at Large, but he also participated in the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and for the Rwanda Tribunal, and for the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. He also led the US negotiating team in the United Nations on talks for the International Criminal Court establishment and the signing of the Rome Statute. We are all very, very lucky to have him as a member of ASU. So again, welcome. And I will hand it over to David to introduce Sasha so that we can begin their exciting discussion about the UN Charter.
Thanks, Andrea. That was far, far too generous. I'm humbled. Welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to host you and also our virtual online audience. I know there are a lot of law students who are cluing in particular, by video right now. What I'd like to do is I'm going to spend about maybe 8-9 minutes or so talking about what today means and also introducing the book to you, which is the UN Charter, 5 Pillars for Humankind. You all have a flyer on your table there. I do want to recognize a lot of faculty colleagues who are here. My sister and brother-in-law are here, and a colleague from the Holocaust Museum here in Washington is with us, and of course ASU students here as well. Welcome to all of you. Today is actually officially, it is every year, on October 24th, it is United Nations Day. But today is rather even more significant because it's the 80th anniversary of the entry into force of the United Nations Charter in a room on Long Island. I forget which college exactly the first meeting of the United Nations took place. But that was where the UN Charter entered into force with the requisite number of ratifying states, including what now constitutes the permanent 5 of the Security Council: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and the People's Republic of China. They all had finally ticked the box. And that means that today, on the 80th anniversary of the Charter, it's a significant day in New York. Right now, meeting as we speak, is the Security Council, and they are recognizing exactly what we are recognizing with their own open debate on the future of the United Nations. So there's a tremendous amount of discussion taking place right now in the Security Council chamber about, frankly, something called UN 80 Initiative by Secretary General Guterres, launched last year, all for the purpose of reforming and streamlining the United Nations and dealing with all of the sort of hot management issues and financial issues that arise so often when we talk about the United Nations, and also just the issue of effectiveness and whether or not, in particular, the Security Council indeed is representative of the large populations and economies and societies of the world compared to what existed in 1945. Interestingly enough, I just want to tell you, as you can imagine, the Security Council in operation right now, Russia is president of the council this month, and it has introduced a concept paper for discussion today among the members, which could read, frankly, as if Finland had authored it, or Canada. It's a remarkable document of generalities of peace and security and human rights and economic progress that is remarkable in its scope. And then, of course, at the end of the discussion in the Security Council today, there is going to be what's called a presidential statement, where all 15 members of the Security Council will, by consensus, agree to the presidential statement. That's been under negotiation for several days in New York. Those negotiations have concluded with a document that everyone has agreed upon. And interestingly enough, the presidential statement, because it's pertinent to this, kind of goes out on a little bit of a limb and stresses the importance of international law. It reaffirms the Council's commitment to an international order based on international law. It also underscores the need for states, international and regional organizations, and relevant partners to respect international law, including the United Nations Charter. And again, relevant to what one would read in here, it stresses the importance of supporting peacekeeping operations as well as bringing regional organizations into the spectrum of international peace and security issues far more than they have during the last 80 years. So anyway, all of that will be in the news tonight, and it signifies the importance of the day. Now, what I want to just very briefly talk to you about is this book, which I co-authored with Dr. Mark Ellis. He is the executive director of the International Bar Association, headquartered in London. He is an American, but he's also a British citizen. And I've known him ever since the 1990s. We collaborated on this book. We enjoyed writing it together. And the reason we wrote this book is because we mark it down. It's 2025. What is the most important secular document in the world? Secular. It's the United Nations Charter. No other document is more important to all of the peoples of the world than what I've been carrying around for 20 years, the UN Charter. It's stapled now. I pulled it out so often. Yet, Mark and I both felt that the younger generations of students, be they in secondary school or at the university level or even the graduate level, we sort of knew that they barely knew the UN Charter, if they know it at all. So it's time in the 80th year to reintroduce the UN Charter to new generations of readers, and to explain how one might contrast the world of 1945, when the Charter was finalized in its text, with the world of 2025. Can we still read the provisions of the UN Charter with relevance to our very different world today, 80 years later, with challenges that were never imagined in 1945. What that means, you have to take a little bit of a leap in interpreting the words of the UN Charter to bring them to life for current times. It is not going to be realistic to talk about amending the UN Charter. You know, spoiler alert, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen in any real-time spectrum. Certainly not, you know, the proposals to amend the UN Charter with respect to the Security Council are there. They were strongly pushed forward by the last US administration at the United Nations. They lay fallow now, and it's simply going to be very, very difficult to ever reach that particular objective. But, you know, there are so many other provisions of this charter which, if one wanted to, you could just take a scalpel to this. First of all, eliminating outdated provisions, which were relevant only to the world of World War II and of the quest for decolonization in the world, which was the big post-war objective in a large chunk of this charter was decolonization. But those days are mostly all behind us now. And yet other threats and you know, situations in the world are very much besetting us. So we need to know how to read, for example, the most famous provision of the Charter, which is Article 2, subparagraph 4, which is the prohibition on the use of force to resolve disputes. It's sort of the lock gate on armed force. There's Article 51, which is its counterpart, which offers the right to use armed force in individual or collective self-defense, the inherent right to do so. How do you balance 2.4 with 5.1 in today's world of autonomous weapons, cyber threats, and nuclear Armageddon, you know, breathing down our necks every day? And by the way, you know, the UN Charter was completed in June of 1945 in San Francisco. The nuclear weapons age had not yet begun, and it was not yet even known to begin soon, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred in August of 1945. There's not a single word in this document about nuclear power. And yet it has dominated so much of the UN's practice ever since 1945. But we do need to understand that kind of, you know, reality, as well as the world that we live in terms of cyberspace, autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, which are changing the world so rapidly that somehow this document, the UN Charter, has to catch up with it and you know, maintain a steady stream of attention to it. I am just going to relate one little story, and then I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Sasha Pitchinger. In writing this, it was so much fun to sort of go back and look at how the UN Charter originated during World War II. And this book tells that story in the opening introduction and chapters. One thing that did occur was right here in Washington, D.C., for those of you who may not have kind of focused on this in your lives yet, there's a place in Georgetown called Dumbarton Oaks. You can go visit it. It's a museum of Byzantine art now, but it has beautiful gardens and everything. Try to visit it in the spring when everything is blooming. And it was at Dumbarton Oaks in August of 1944 that four major powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and China met to basically draft the first draft of the UN Charter. After having many intersects ever since 1940, sort of talking about the vision of what would happen after the war, they finally sat down at Dumbarton Oaks to draft the charter. When they were completed with that exercise in October of 1944, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who truly was the visionary for the UN Charter, and we tell that story a little bit in the book. He decided that the only way he would prevail right in the middle of a war, with his vision of the United Nations being created right at the end of the war, would be to go out into the American communities and neighborhoods and sell it to them. So he became, and of course he delegated a ton of this, super political. There was a community by community campaign across the United States to introduce everyone to the Dumbarton Oaks proposals. That's what they were called. Town meetings, discussions, et cetera, so that by the time San Francisco's conference began in April of 1945, lasting until June of 1945, the American public was totally prepped for what was going on in San Francisco. Thus, of course, Roosevelt died just before San Francisco. Then Harry Truman picks up the mantle. He had been leading the effort in the United States Senate for the UN Charter ever since late 1943, early 1944. So he continued that kind of political mandate in the United States, meaning that when the charter was finally finished in San Francisco in late June of 45, President Harry Truman immediately brought it to the United States Senate, gave eloquent speeches about it, and by late July of 1945, the US Senate, hearing from all of their constituents out in America, ratified the UN Charter by a vote of 89-2. Done. And the United States became the leader in creating the United Nations, in part given the very rapid ratification by the US Senate. And by the way, there's a fantastic couple of days of debate at the US, in the US Senate during this ratification process about Article 43 of the UN Charter, which was to create sort of a standing armed force for the United Nations with contributions by various countries. You can just imagine the cynicism within the US Senate that one might envision today if that proposal were presented. Yet if you read through all of those debates, you will see senators one after another getting up and saying, yes, we believe in Article 43 and we believe in it for the following reasons. So anyway, a fascinating backstory, and I am now going, and so a lot of it's told here. So now we come to the best part of this program, which is Sasha Pippinger. And Sasha is someone I've known for some time here in Washington. She's a distinguished fellow at Arizona State University. Most recently, she was the Director of Peace Processes at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Sasha's career in the United Nations includes 3 years working on the Syrian peace process as the Special Assistant to the UN Special Envoy for Syria. Prior to that, she was based in the Central African Republic as a political advisor to the deputy head of MINUSCA, the UN's peacekeeping mission there. She has also worked on the UN team supporting Yemen's national dialogue and the Constituent Assembly in Nepal. Outside of the UN, Sasha worked for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue office in East and Central Africa, for the International Rescue Committee in Pakistan, and as an election monitor and researcher in Sudan. Sasha has a particular interest in peace process design, ceasefire negotiation, multilateral mediation, and of course, international humanitarian law. She holds a JD degree from Harvard Law School, a certificate in transnational law from the Université de Genève, and a BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. So you cannot beat that. So, Sasha, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I was listening to Ambassador Sheffer, I was realizing that he actually got the quite cushy job of telling you how the UN was designed and all the lovely aspirations and ideas therein, and that I get the distinction of telling you how messy and imperfect it is when you try and operationalize that UN Charter and what it looks like in reality. But the truth is, the UN Charter is still an incredibly important part of everything the UN does. And I forgot it today, but I have my own copy of the UN Charter, and it's very weathered because I carry it with me everywhere. And that sounds corny, but it is true that all of those roles that Ambassador Sheffer mentioned in the UN fall squarely under the UN Charter. So when I was working on peace processes, that's Chapter 6 of the UN Charter that talks about the peaceful settlement of disputes between member states, but also increasingly within member states, and the role the UN can play there. But working for a peacekeeping mission, the one I worked for was mandated under Chapter 7, which is about the actions the UN can take in regards to threats to international peace and security. And I'm going to focus my reflections today, I think, a bit on my time in that peacekeeping mission in MINUSCA, because I think that experience really captures the sort of those aspirations, the vision, the intent of the UN Charter, but also the scale and the complexity and the limitations when you are trying to put all of those lovely ideas into practice. So when I tell people that I worked in a UN peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic, I sometimes get funny looks. And I always think that they're trying to imagine me, who has never served in any armed forces, wearing sort of the camo fatigues and the iconic blue helmet and carrying an arm. And the reality is, of course, no, I was a civilian. Most peacekeeping missions today no longer just have police and military personnel. But I think when people think about what is UN peacekeeping, they do imagine that old school peacekeeping, which is there's sort of maybe a ceasefire line and UN peacekeepers patrolling both sides of that line to make sure there's no sort of live fire over it, that no one's trying to enter into anyone else's territory. And that is how UN peacekeeping started. So in the years after Pakistan became independent from India, and there were disputes between Pakistan and India over the territory in Kashmir, once they reached a ceasefire, the UN did deploy military observers, and those were some of the earliest blue helmets, and they did not have arms. They were operating under Chapter 6 and not Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And really all they did was observe, monitor, report back on what was happening. But in the decades since then, increasingly, peacekeeping has really changed shape. And now, in the last few decades, what we've seen is something that the UN calls multidimensional peacekeeping missions. And what that means in common speak is that instead of just unarmed military observers, we now, on one hand, have peacekeepers, military personnel that have the ability to use more force and be more assertive than their sort of predecessors in UN peacekeeping. They have more permissive rules of engagement, but they also function alongside police personnel and civilians, and that they are all integrated together to achieve this sort of broader set of tasks. And part of the reason that peacekeeping has evolved this way is because it recognizes the fact that there is no peace without security, and there's no security without rule of law, and there's no rule of law without institutions. And so at the end of the day, it's not really possible for a UN force to go in and just secure a peace without attending to all of the other things that conflict has wrought on these countries, and to help those countries be able to move into a sustainable peace and transition. So you're probably asking yourself, okay, that's nice, but what do all these civilians do all day if they're not patrolling a ceasefire line? So when I got to MINUSCA, there was about 15,000 of us in that country. And that's a country that, it's hard to get population estimates because they haven't had a census in a gajillion years, but is maybe 4 million people. So 15,000 peacekeepers is a pretty heavy footprint. And of those 15,000, 11,000 of them were traditional military, 2,000 were police, and then about 1,500 of us were civilians. And we were doing all sorts of stuff. So there was civilians that were human rights monitors that were monitoring what was happening in the country. We had civilians that were political affairs that were helping coordinate the peace process and that would give support when the Central African Parliament wanted to draft new legislation, for example. We had civilians doing security sector reform. We had them working on the hybrid criminal court for transitional justice work. We had them doing disarmament programs for armed groups. We had them, we had a joint mission analysis center where we had our civilian intel analysts working alongside the military intel. So it was a pretty crowded base. And then, of course, you have mission support, which is everything needed to sustain 15,000 people deployed in a country. So legal, HR, transport, all of that. And what I just described, that is just the UN peacekeeping mission. But the reality is there was tons of other UN actors inside the country. So there's what you call the UN country team, right? So you have UNICEF and the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, and the UN Development Program, and the UN Mine Action Service, and on and on and on. So many UN entities that have been born in those last 80 years since the UN Charter that have very specialized tasks and operate independently of the peacekeeping mission. And then you add to that all of the sort of delegations of officials that would come into the country to do different things. Maybe they were investigating whether there are violations of the sanctions regime, or maybe it was a special rapporteur on crimes against women. So there was a constant stream of UN officials everywhere in the country. And in fairness to the Central Africans, they had no idea what the difference between all of us were, and why should they? So I have a very vivid memory of traveling with my boss in a helicopter, and we were going to meet a head of an armed group that was rarely met with international actors and was in a very remote part of the country. And we sat down and we sort of asked, let's start by talking about what your grievances are so we can understand how to move forward with this peace process. And this armed group leader looked at us and said, I've told you all this before and you did nothing. In fact, not only did you do nothing, but you added me to the sanctions list. And we're sort of looking at each other, and my boss says, but sir, this is the first time we've ever met you. And he's like, but I told the UN this already. And goodness knows what UN official found their way to this armed group leader and had this conversation with him. We'll never know. But the point is, they're not going to distinguish between all these different functions. To them, we are just one big UN. And so then the burden, of course, falls on the UN to speak with one voice and to integrate itself so that that's a semi-functional relationship. And that is where you get all of the criticism of the UN about how it's bureaucratic. Yeah, it's bureaucratic. There's a lot to coordinate, and people, whether they're sitting in headquarters in New York or whether they're sitting in a remote field office in the Central African Republic, have to spend a lot of their day in meetings coordinating with all these other UN actors. And you know, when you read Ambassador Sheffer's book, it talks about these core tenets. And the reality is that while all incredibly important, they are sometimes in tension with one another. And part of the work of the UN is navigating those tensions. So for example, human rights and humanitarianism. One of the core functions people are familiar with in the world of the UN is providing humanitarian assistance. Another function that I just described is attending to issues of international peace and security. So this sounds like it would be complementary, but in practice on the ground, you can kind of run into issues, because if you imagine from the perspective of a humanitarian, let's say you are operating in the Central African Republic and you are delivering essential foodstuffs and water to an internally displaced community. And they look at us that are carrying arms, sometimes even doing offensive operations, that are engaged in active hostilities with armed groups across the country, that are, for all intensive purposes, to an average person, looking like they are engaged in a state of war. And they say, we don't really want to be associated with that UN, because that UN is going to be targeted. It's going to be targeted by people that have been subject to the coercive action of the UN, that are against its political agenda. So if we're just delivering food and water, we'd actually prefer that people still think of us as the good guys. And so that fundamental tension led to something that internally is referred to as Black UN and Blue UN. And it's called that because peacekeeping mission personnel have, when you think of the UN vehicles, you think of those big white Land Rovers, right? That say a huge UN on the side and even on the top so that helicopters can see it. So if you're working for a peacekeeping mission, those letters of the UN are going to be in the color black. But the humanitarians insisted and were successful in having their vehicles say UN and have that lettering be in blue so that we could distinguish between one another, but more importantly, the Central Africans could distinguish between the two of us. And that comes out of a recognition that those functions are very different and that there are consequences to humanitarians if they are associated with the work of a peacekeeping operation, which is understandably sometimes a lot less popular than delivering food aid. And so it was not rare that we would get an invitation to attend a meeting at the office of another UN agency, or maybe even a social gathering. And they would write at the bottom of the invitation, no Black UN vehicles, right? Because they took this so seriously that they didn't even want us driving our Black lettered UN vehicles over to their headquarters in case someone that was surveilling or just happened to be there noticed it and associated them with the activities of our forces. So that's the kind of complexity that you hit inside of the UN. Now, another place that the UN is criticized a lot is peacekeeping missions. They don't have the best reputation around the planet. And part of that is because they have the most impossible mandate on the planet, which is that they are responsible for doing something that often their hands are tied and limited from doing. So when they come into a country, you will always hear reports of violence within a country, of massacres, of attacks, of incidents that happened. And the report will specify, and the UN peacekeepers were on site, or the UN peacekeepers were aware, or the UN peacekeepers were a kilometer away and they did nothing. And what that looks like to a casual observer is that maybe they're incompetent, maybe they're uninterested in protecting civilians, maybe they don't care. But the actual reality of that is much more complicated, right? Because to start with, UN peacekeepers are not part of some beautiful UN standing army, right? The UN does not itself have an army. So when we put those 11,000 soldiers together in MINUSCA, it's just a patchwork of different contributed troops from all sorts of other countries, from member states of the UN that say, sure, you can have one battalion of our soldiers, but they'll only do this. And then another country will say, yeah, you can borrow our special forces unit, but you can only use them for 2 days out of the month, and you have to make sure that they're always within 6 hours of a hospital for evacuation. So the reality is that that whole force is composed of different units that themselves have different rules of engagement, different sets of training, and also, by the way, speak different languages. So as you can imagine, functionally, that's actually incredibly hard for them to work together. And I have one specific memory that I always think about when people criticize UN peacekeepers. And the scenario was, there was an operation that was being planned by MINUSCA, and it was essentially to forcibly disarm a bunch of criminal gangs that were operating in an urban space in Central African Republic. And this will lead us to another point later, which is asking military forces to do essentially what is urban policing also creates all sorts of difficulties, as you can imagine. But so this operation was being planned, and it was an evening operation. We have a situation room that certainly was not as glamorous as the one that they must have at the White House or that they use in DC. It was in a sort of shipping container, which is, we all lived in shipping containers basically, that were assembled on a compound. But we did have live screens, and we had coordination mechanisms with all the troops that were going to run this operation. And then a bunch of us civilians were in there to support. And here's what I want you to imagine. The operation didn't go perfectly. It was successful, but it didn't go perfectly. And part of the reason it didn't go perfectly is that we had, our force commander was a Senegalese who spoke French was his native language. He had a force chief of staff who functioned as his deputy that was Portuguese and spoke Portuguese. His head of intel was an American who spoke English, and of course, as with most Americans, only English. And then the 2 battalions that they had doing the actual operation, one was from Pakistan, so they speak Urdu, and the other one was from Egypt, so they speak Arabic. And we can cope in the UN system with those kind of complexities when it's something like giving mission orders, right? We have people that speak lots of languages, we have interpreters and translators. But when it comes to a live operation in the middle of the night and they're communicating over walkie-talkies that were donated by some member state a decade ago and aren't charged because we share a generator between the hospital and the security forces, it gets really messy really fast. And then to add to that, we had a Moroccan colleague that was sitting in the situation room with us that was fluent in French and Arabic and was trying to help with this chain of command, with the direct communications during this operation. And the Egyptian comes over the radio and says, I can't understand his Arabic. Can you just switch back to English? So like that is what they are dealing with in just trying to do a basic operation. The other thing I want to tell you about the force and the UN peacekeepers, this is going to be kind of a gross story, so I'm sorry for any of you that are not done eating, but some of you might be familiar with the mango fly, which is an insect that I think is common in the tropics and certainly prevalent in Africa. And the thing about this mango fly is it lays its eggs in fabric. And then if you are so unlucky as to come into contact with that fabric that has the mango fly eggs, its larva likes to burrow into human skin. And so one day, an ordinary day at the office, I was talking to a colleague of mine that had worked in the Central African Republic for many more years. And I was talking and I was going like this, and she looks at my arm and she goes, "You have a mango fly or larva in your arm." And I had thought it was a mosquito bite. But she had become very fluent in all of the different diseases that were available to us in the Central African Republic. So when you're a UN peacekeeper, your first port of call, you're often operating in countries that do not have established or modern medical systems. So we actually had a hospital, a clinic that was run by UN peacekeepers, by a medical force. And so I went to our hospital, was on our compound, very convenient. And I went in, and as I was sitting there and the doctor was talking to me, I noticed that he kept consulting these sort of laminated sheets he had in front of him. And when he left the room to go get something, I sort of looked at those laminated sheets, and I saw that they basically had pictures, like pictograms, showing different things different conditions that could arise in the tropics. And then it would tell you what medication to give. And then there was another column that says, if you have given too much of this medication, then give this other medication. And you're sitting here and you're like, if my doctor needs a cheat sheet about how to course correct when he's sent me to an overdose of the treatment he's giving me, that doesn't instill a ton of confidence in the medical treatment I'm receiving. But the reality is that this medical group, they were Serbian soldiers. And so it made sense that they would be sent to a peacekeeping mission. I'm sure they're amazing at dressing wounds on a battlefield, and they're very well trained. But goodness knows that none of their training, taught or through lived experience, had anything to do with malaria or mango fly larva being embedded in someone. So that just comes to one of the basic ideas about how UN peacekeeping works, or rather doesn't work, which is that there's real big questions about how fit for purpose the people that are being deployed are to do the tasks that are being asked of them. And that's, again, that same concept where if we are sending armed soldiers into the Central African Republic, but what they end up doing a lot of the time is, patrolling urban spaces, conducting raids, think SWAT forces, right? Should we really be bringing in soldiers that have only ever done deployments on the battlefield? Are we choosing the right personnel to come in and do these tasks? And of course, what the UN headquarters would say is, we take what we can get. It's not up to us. We ask for all of these things. We have our wish lists of the kind of force we'd like to build. But understandably, very few member states are willing to give their best, most talented, most essential functions on donation to the United Nations. And so the reality is that you just have to work with what you can have. I will say that what was very special about working in a UN peacekeeping mission as someone that has worked on peace processes my whole career. I think I'd worked on maybe 5 by the time I got to Central African Republic. And being there and working for the UN there was revelatory, because in every prior peace process, all you can do is talk. If you're working for the mediator or if you're working with the parties, talking is the only thing on the table. You need to persuade parties to comply with the peace agreement. You need to ask them nicely, and when they don't do it, you can maybe sort of imply that there might be consequences from the international community, but rarely there are. And that's the only tool you have. But when you're doing a peace process in the shadow of a peacekeeping force, you now have some leverage. You have some people that can operationalize that. So when an armed group says they're going to dismantle a checkpoint, not only do you have people there to notice that they in fact did not dismantle it, but our force can then go in and proactively dismantle it and hold that territory until they comply with the terms of the ceasefire. So it is an incredible evolution of how the UN has learned to be engaged in these really complex dynamics. And what I will say is, it was among the hardest jobs I've ever had, but it was also probably the most extraordinary, and probably the most interesting, because we were in this incredibly complex post-conflict environment, and the UN was essentially integrated into all of the functions of the state. So you learn everything about how a country can or should run. So when you think about working with the UN, did I get to fly in helicopters and meet armed groups? Yes. Did I get to sit in these situation rooms and help inform live operations? Yes. Did I also spend many long nights correcting the grammar for Secretary General reports that were going to New York? Also, yes. And here's a fun fact that the French word for grenade is the same word they use for the fruit pomegranate. So you can imagine all of the mistranslated situation reports that would hit my desk. And that was my job, was to retranslate grenade or pomegranate back to grenade. So that's the kind of glory you can expect in a United Nations career. But I will say it's an extraordinary opportunity. And to all the people that criticize the UN, what I say to them is, it's supposed to be hard. We are literally, this is the closest thing we have to world governance. And we are literally trying to take every country on this planet, or 193 of them, and we are trying to mobilize all those people to work in synchronization to solve literally the hardest, most complex challenges known to humankind. So yes, it's going to be messy. It's going to be imperfect. There's a lot of learning that needs to happen. And as Ambassador Sheffer said, there's a lot of adaptation that needs to happen as the world changes. But it is my belief that the UN is as relevant as it ever was, as it was 80 years ago when that UN charter came into force. And it will be still relevant 80 years from now, but we all need to be part of helping modernize that international governance and international cooperation to make it so. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Well, we have about 20 minutes to share our time with Sasha. And I just want to start with one and only one question. And I didn't prep you for this, Sasha. So if you want to just take a pass, take a pass. I had a little episode in my life 20 years ago where for about a year and a half, I was the senior vice president of the UN Association of the United States of America. So my offices were both in the New York headquarters and on Mass Ave and what is now the Carnegie Endowment building, where UNA had its Washington office. And I had the opportunity to go around the country constantly to small communities, to large cities, et cetera, to talk about the United Nations, and also sometimes to oversee Model UN Day at the local high school, you know, that drill. But one of the things I sort of always talked about in my stump speech to Rotary clubs and everything else was that it is the personnel of the United Nations who are on the front lines globally of trying to deal with the hardest problems of humankind. You will find UN staffers, be they civilian or military within a peacekeeping operation. They are on the front lines every single day, and they're taking risks with their lives every single day. And it is the toughest job because frankly, they're getting hit with what cosmically we talk about as the tough problems of humankind, be it humanitarian, peace and security or otherwise. But they're literally right in the middle of it, confronting it, the face of the warlord, et cetera. So my question, Sasha, is this. Can you draw from your memory any particular day when you would say at the end of the day that you saw some UN personnel civilian or military, who you would say was so courageous that day?
Yeah, I mean, there's almost too many days to count, particularly in the peacekeeping force, but also working on peace processes. You hit the right point here, Ambassador Sheffer, which is that UN personnel can never make everyone happy. They are trying to fix something that is broken beyond repair, and there is often not a way to approach that is going to have all stakeholders equally contented with what you're doing. And so, for example, when I was working for the UN envoy for Syria, when he would prepare to brief the Security Council, there would be weeks spent analyzing every word that would be said. And that was because there was so little room to maneuver under the UN mandate and in a way that would not set the peace process that he was helping coordinate backwards. So there's almost no upside to someone that is mediating a peace process speaking publicly ever. There's almost nothing good you can do by speaking publicly about a peace process. Sometimes it's helpful to explain what's going on to try and build support for it. But in most cases, anything you say out loud is going to hurt what's happening inside the room. I think in terms of things I can speak about on the record, there's several experiences that come to mind. But I think of there was a day where violence against the peacekeeping mission, and this is the piece I didn't speak explicitly to, but there was plenty of people in the Central African Republic that weren't happy about our presence there. I should have also said that everything we did there was at the request of the Central African government. So it wasn't our judgment that they needed support with this or that, and that's why we deployed people. It was the Central African government saying, we could use this help. Can you, UN, come in with our consent to help with this? But that didn't mean that the complicated networks of criminal groups and armed groups and even some civilians would be happy with everything we did there. Obviously not. And so there was a time when, if you remember me mentioning that there could often be incidents in the country, security incidents, and in the eyes of the public, understandably, the UN fell short in responding to those incidents. And they would take that out by protesting against our compound. And we were mostly safe within the compound, but they would use these very low-tech sort of projectiles and throw them over the walls of our compound. So it would be essentially like Molotov cocktails, or sometimes it would just be small arms fire. And so it was very rare that it penetrated into the compound, but it did happen. And I remember I had a colleague who was an analyst and was always someone that was less comfortable with the security situation than others. People have different risk tolerances, even once you're in a war zone. And I remember that he came to work after one of the nights where there had been a lot of protest around the compound, and I still have a picture of it to this day. In his desk, there is embedded 2 bullets. And so had he been sitting at that desk during the night, their trajectory would have gone through him. And so he showed up that day and realized that it was entirely possible that he could have been sitting at that desk and been struck by those bullets. And moreover, we don't have a lot of spare gear. So he had to continue using that desk with those bullets embedded. Later, they took out the bullets, but the holes were still there. He continued to use that desk for, I think, the next 6 months. And I remember thinking, every day that he shows up and sits in that chair again and looks at those bullet holes and knows that he could be a casualty on the basis of the work he's doing, that's courage to me, right? That he believed enough in the contribution he was making that he was willing to risk it.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I'd like to open it up for questions now from those of you in the audience who'd like to probe Sasha's experience in particular in various peacekeeping operations.
Or ask
Yes.
a book.
Well, we honor you, Ambassador Polt.
I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I'm Mike Polt. I'm part of the Leadership Diplomacy and National Security Lab. We're living at a time globally where the international order, the rule of law in an international sense, is being questioned by multiple countries, by, if you wish, various leaders in various countries and their societies. And Ambassador Schaffer was talking about the campaign emanating from Dumbarton Oaks to go around the United States to convince the American people to sign on to the UN system and to the UN Charter for passage. What actions is the UN think? First of all, does the UN look at the problem of the disintegration of this commitment to international order and rule of law, if there ever was such a commitment, or at least a limited commitment that existed? Is the UN thinking about this problem and doing anything globally, not at UN headquarters in the various meetings, because that's insiders talking to insiders, but around populations to go ahead and try and reinvigorate a commitment to a rules-based international system? I know it's a long question, but be interested to hear your thoughts.
No, it's a very important one. And I think, one of the first questions we ask ourselves is it a resistance to a rules-based international system from some actors, or is it a resistance to the set of rules, the content of that rules-based international order that we've been functioning under? And for our law students in here, right, it's not dissimilar from analysis of constitutional interpretation, right? The Constitution and the UN Charter reflect a compromise that was made at a very specific moment in time that balanced those equities. And it's understandable now that you have countries coming and saying, okay, but we weren't really part of that conversation back then. We didn't really think through, we didn't have the opportunity to weigh in on who would be a permanent member of the Security Council back then, and the world has changed a lot. And so we expect the UN to adapt itself to that. I think one of the best examples I have there's obviously a totally separate question about UN reform and how the UN and the Security Council needs to change to adapt to changing circumstances, but that's the insiders piece. In terms of what it looks like in practice in the world, I think the reality is there is this big tension between the principles that are espoused in the UN Charter and that represent the identity of the UN as the organization, and the fact that the UN it is not the boss of itself, right? If you work for the UN, you have 193 bosses if you consider it the membership of the General Assembly, or 15 bosses if it's the Security Council, or 5 bosses if you think it's just the P5 of the Security Council. And the UN can do very little in that space to move the needle in terms of especially values-based and rules-based normative issues in the face of that, because there's not very much room for the Secretary General or the organization to have an entity or a position unto themselves that is unaffected by that larger set. So the way that I saw it the most working on peace processes is when in the sort of early 2000s, there was all sorts of guidance. The UN was very involved in leading lots of peace processes, and it would appoint envoys, and they were usually from a Scandinavian country or a former head of state. They had a very specific profile to peacemaking. And the UN developed all this guidance about how you should run a peace process and who should be a mediator and what the principles are. And fast forward 20 years, and the reality is that the UN is no longer mediating a majority of peace processes, right? There's all sorts of other actors in that space. And quite frankly, some of these new emerging mediation powers, whether it's Turkey or Qatar, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Brazil, many of them don't actually subscribe to the same principles that were developed by the UN's technical experts, right? They look at the concept of sending a completely impartial Swiss diplomat to deal with something in Borneo, and they say, we've actually found that sending in someone that has close relationships with the party, that's not impartial, and that actually has a stake in the outcome, has worked well for us in our region, and we want to push that way. And so the UN is in this position of having to embrace this new reality, that it is no longer the key actor in this space, and accommodate the fact that even the norms that it set for itself, that it thought would be the international architecture for this, are being eroded by different points of view that come from UN member states, but now have a bigger voice than maybe they did back then. So I think you do see it play out, but in terms of space for the UN to, in its own engagement in the world, try and advance a rules-based international order that is not necessarily a consensus of today's current Security Council, it's very hard for them to do that.
More questions? Yes. Mhm.
Thank you, Sasha, for that. That was really insightful, and I took a lot from that. My name is Danish Kadri. I'm a student here at the lab. My question has to do with more of the field work you did on the ground when working with peacekeeping forces. When you're conducting operations, it requires a lot of coordination with the host government, I would assume. And like you mentioned, all the challenges with all the countries that are contributing to the peacekeeping force. So what are some of the challenges when you're on the ground working with a host nation? And what would you say are your biggest takeaways for tackling those challenges?
Yeah, so the reality is when I was in Central African Republic, for example, the government was a transitional government through this transitional period. But the reality is that governments are still political. And so we had something, basically a high coordinating body that had, in particular, all the security forces. The leadership from all the Central African security forces were there, as long also representatives from the office of the president and political actors within the government. And they would coordinate with our mission leadership of the peacekeeping operation, because we understood for a whole range of reasons that nothing would go well if it was not pre-agreed and pre-understood and coordinated with local authorities. But the reality is that the local authorities also have their own political preferences, right? And they have interests that may relate to the stakeholder group that they're part of or their own political aspirations in the country. That's normal. It's true in this country as well, of course. But that meant that they were sometimes drawing from a different framework in their decision-making than we were. And so what was interesting and what happens a lot in the UN is that there's a very interesting calculus about what the UN should and does take credit for when you're working in support of national institutions. And there's this careful calibration in which our overall goal in the peacekeeping mission is to have a sustainable peace in that country, and that will only happen once the population builds confidence in their own government to supply security and other services to them. And so we understood part of our mandate was to advance that process and to help build that trust so that the UN would no longer be needed. But there was also sometimes unpopular things that had to be done, whether it was dismantling lucrative criminal networks or blocking drug trade or returning refugees, and that there was times when it was important for the UN to take the fall for those things. And so the reality is, at the end of the day, we were there at the consent of the Central African government, and they got the final say on what happened. And we were thoughtful in our interactions with them about where we should be silent support, equipping them to lead their own operations, and where we should be clearly acting on behalf of the UN, sometimes to enable us to take the inevitable political fallout.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Yes. Hey.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andriy Pasichnik. I'm a counselor at the Embassy of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to thank both of the speakers for their excellent, outstanding presentations. I was fascinated to hear the story how UN practically works. Thank you very much for that, Sasha. And I have a two-bullet question, if I may. First of all, Ambassador Schaffer, what struck me in your remarks is that you said that on this day, 80 years ago, representatives of 5 countries that now represent P5 signed the UN Charter. The People's Republic of China is not in the UN Charter, you know it. The Russian Federation, what now occupies the place, is placed in P5, is not in the UN Charter. Even if we can compare People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which is in the original document, then USSR and Russian Federation are completely 2 different states, okay? So I understand all of the political background behind those 2 decisions. And my question is, do you think if it has been an error, Is there a way to rectify it? And a second part, what I wanted to ask is that it is obvious that the UN Charter, in many of its pieces, is obsolete. It does not reflect the reality of today. So as you said, I will not just repeat it. You mentioned the most crucial points. Also, Sasha mentioned that many state actors erode some core practical functions of the United Nations on the ground, such as war prevention and mediation. So my question to both of you, if I may, from both academic and practical point of view, don't you have the feeling that UN as a whole is running out of time, as the League of Nations has ran out of time? If I'm not mistaken, while being one of the major promoters of the idea of the United Nations, President Roosevelt anticipated it to maintain peace for approximately 50 years. So from this perspective, has the UN Charter achieved its goal and should be replaced, or should it be renovated somehow? Thank you so much.
Because we're from the same embassy, Katya Smagli from Ukraine. I just met my colleague who works at our mission at the United Nations in New York, and she was telling me stories about how the United States stopped paying its contribution to the United Nations. It is the decision of the President Trump administration, and how this example led to other countries stopping paying their contribution. So what does this attitude and policy tells us about the future of the organization? Thank you.
Okay, these are three cosmic questions.
I have 2 weeks.
Sasha, if you don't mind, I'll take the first crack at it and take the last one first. A very prescient comment, because China now has fallen into deep arrears on its assessments to the United Nations. So while China is, the People's Republic of China, is trying to increase its influence within the UN system in many ways, including getting its own officials to head up various UN specialized agencies and various divisions within the UN system itself, and to bring sort of a block of the Global South with it on important votes in various UN organs, whether it be the General Assembly, Security Council, UN Human Rights Council, etc. The irony is that one can also view China quite critically in that it's depriving the United Nations of the very resources that it needs to achieve the very thing it's trying to proselytize about with so many countries in the system. And there was a Financial Times article about this about a month or a half ago that I was interviewed for that really brought this issue out, very starkly. So it's a reality. I would just say that one thing, in terms of interpreting the UN Charter and whether it's relevant anymore, remember that we're still interpreting the US Constitution, and it doesn't mean that the document is irrelevant. It still remains a very dynamic document under interpretation by the Supreme Court, and that is no less different than the UN Charter. It will continue to be the object of interpretation. That doesn't mean that the end is in sight for the document. It just means we have to be smart enough to move forward with it, which is the purpose of the book. And I would also just mention a story that we actually tell in the book about Ukraine, which was the bargain that Stalin cut with Roosevelt on the votes at the membership of the United Nations. There was deep opposition by Stalin to Argentina coming in to the circle of original San Francisco parties, and then part of the original group of countries finalizing the charter, because Argentina had really more or less stuck with the Axis powers until almost the end in early 1945, before it switched its allegiance to the Allies, and Stalin took this personally. Yet, Stalin was insisting on Ukraine and Belarus having their own individual votes within the UN system, even though the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. So a deal had to be struck, and at the end of the day, Argentina was permitted into the exclusive club, but so did Stalin achieve his objective of Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. Well, Ukraine and Belarus having their own votes, and then Poland being manipulated to achieve a pro-Stalin government that in fact would not be part of the Allied camp. It was all a scheme and a strategy that played out. So Ukraine was probably for worse, part of that whole situation. And I'm going to leave it there because our time is running out. But Sasha, your response.
Well, I'll just say quickly that when I think about evaluating the utility of the UN today, I don't think the starting point is how effective is the UN at responding to today's challenges. I think the starting point has to be, given contemporary geopolitical dynamics, could we go back to the table and negotiate something that works better than this? And since I'm quite confident in my assessment that the answer is no, then I think we have to take the UN as basically the only car available to us to drive and just focus on making improvements where we can. If we designed the UN today, would it look anything like what was set out in the UN Charter? No, of course not. If we designed the internet today, it would look nothing like the original internet. But we have to work with the compromise that we had, and we have to strive and endeavor to adapt it as time goes on. But the reality is that it's the best we've got. And I don't think there's a universe right now with the current political climate where we could build something better and more responsive to the world's problems. So I think that just focuses our attention on what we need to do to make the UN more responsive, more effective.
And on that note, we come to closure. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it very much.